Well, we just did a huge neoliberal experiment in the 1990s. It was extraordinarily naive, but many influential people went along with it. So what we had was a housing policy that was the envy of many, many other countries in the world. We had access to home ownership. I was giving figures there today. In 1991, 46% of the people on state mortgages were beneficiaries. 30% were women, women-led households. 86% of Māori loans were with the state, and they were providing equity so that people could have a stake in the society, could create wealth for themselves as well as income, in the sort of balanced way that we measure equality, which is about income and wealth. And then the two parties that had slowly built up, in the post-war years, that sort of stability, didn't in step, competed with each other in a sense to do more of that. Then suddenly both of them changed and in step removed all the stuff. So it began actually with Labour, who did it in the economic area, and then the national government moved right into the social area. So there was the famous mother of all budgets that the Minister of Finance, Ruth Richardson, led, that just sort of ate into beneficiary incomes, and the Housing Restructuring Act, and basically it privileged the market. It had this sort of unbelievably naive belief in the market that it would somehow, if we just educated people to be rational about it, it would provide affordable housing. And so they just removed all the interest subsidies on people's mortgages. They started selling off state houses and moved state house rents up to a market level, and then provided this accommodation supplement, which they provided far too low. So it appears to be cynical, because it wasn't enough, certainly, to continue home ownership, and many people in renting couldn't afford their rents. They provided this as the only social contribution. Everything else was in the market, and the whole idea was that people would become rational about the market, and that would increase the supply, and people would make rational choices and would be happy in all of that. And as it created more and more losses, like home ownership in just that 10 years of that government, well, it was 9 years, home ownership dropped 18% for Māori. And over the whole period from 1990 to 2013, it dropped 10% for all homeowners and for the total population, and home ownership dropped 25% for Māori, 2.5 times more. And all this was being monitored as it went along, and no one has really changed the policy until recently, with this amazing work as a result of Mahi Ka Ora and the big Māori housing investment, Whai Kaianga, Whai Oranga. Well, you can't, and in a sense, New Zealand's pulled back from it in many ways. It's just requires much more investment with housing, because housing is expensive, and it's become, New Zealand has one of the most unaffordable housing if you measure it by the multiple average. The average of house prices with the average income, so it's income to house price ratios. New Zealand is now the highest in the world, so it's very expensive, and part of it's the lack of supply, but the other part of it is the lack of low-cost building and the lack of subsidy. So what I tried to say in that address was that the rationale prior to the 1990s was that the market was okay for most people, but for poorer people, it wasn't possible to get the stability that was needed. And so that's where the government came in and provided help. So it didn't create welfare dependency. It put people into houses. It created independence from, many people who qualified for those never had to draw a welfare benefit or anything. It was only when they stopped that you get so much more use of welfare money. It just backfires so badly. So I think what is happening now is we're on the cusp of actually trying to turn that around, or that's certainly the address that the CEO of HUD, Andrew Crisp, gave today. And that's what's been shown in the what is now almost $1 billion in the Whai Kaianga Whai Oranga, the Whai Kaianga, Whai Oranga package. And that's the sort of scale we need, but it's got to happen for probably 2 decades, as it did. From 1960 to 1986, what people don't realise is governments were spending, on average, investing in home ownership for ordinary households, about $1.5 billion, this is using 2017 dollars, $1.5 billion annually. And the commitment that they've begun to make now is not even at that level. So it's got to grow. But they're starting to do things at scale. And as long as they continue to do that and build that, and they've got to set goals. I mean, Māori home ownership rates have got to get to the same levels as the rest of the population as an initial goal. I mean, that's really important. Pacific people have got to be invested in, and they get up there too, so that we start getting the equity working. And then there's a need to preserve that because it's stability for our children. Our children's brains are developing through all this process of housing and people moving and changing schools, huge insecurity with the unaffordable rents and stuff. I mean, we just have to do something about this. And there are indications that we might be beginning to grasp the nettle, but it's got to continue through different governments. So you're raising the question about the difference between a home and a housing commodity, which is traded. And so what's happened is we've turned housing into a commodity when it used to be for building homes. So one of the things that we've got to do is to recapture the vision, and that is the vision of HUD. I mean, that's their official vision, is that they'll recognise that housing is there as people's homes, and the focus needs to be on homes. And at the moment, they're a property commodity that gets traded, and so people get treated really badly. So you've got to develop measures, and you've got to have rules that enforce that. So part of that is that there's a huge tax advantage that you have if you're a landlord, because we don't have a capital gains tax. And so there's huge benefits to invest in that rather than the sort of productive investment that we need in our society, to get our various industries and technologies up and running, which is where we should be investing. But both governments have shown that they're very shy to do this. There was a huge opportunity a few years ago to introduce a capital gains tax, and that hasn't happened. So there is at the moment a conflict between this vision of HUD's to understand that people need homes, and the way the housing market is continuing to work. They're at odds with each other. So it's going to take some quite radical political change for that to occur. But the cost at the moment to people is really serious. The biggest cost is for children. So children are brought up with parents that are really worried. They're paying 40, 45, sometimes 50% of their income and even more. And they're anxious and they're worried, and they often have to move, and they're often living in unhealthy houses. So rental houses, the research shows in New Zealand that rental houses are of much lower standard. There's much more dampness and mould and these types of things. So when a landlord wants to just change something, as they often do at will, they just people have to move areas. They have to the kids have to change schools. This destroys relationships and so on. So children's brains are developing in those earliest years, in those first 3 years, 5 years at different levels. And of course they go through another huge spurt during adolescence. So what gets lost is how important the investment in those children and their brains and their well-being actually has an economic consequence later on. That's not the reason why you're doing it. You're doing it so they can live a whole and fruitful life. But the absurd sort of economics of continuing to have a property market rather than building so people can have homes and comfort like many other countries do, places of security, places of continuity. The cost is really great, because when children are growing up in that sort of situation, you're losing half the potential intellectual and creative workforce for the future anyway. It doesn't even add up economically, quite apart from all the social damage it creates. The housing crisis is biting deeply into the children of the middle classes. So more and more people are actually informed about how serious the situation is, because their children can't even begin to afford a deposit, and even the bank of mum and dad is beyond a lot of families these days. So, it's like all these things. Capitalism in the market has, it has a place. It generates income, and it can provide for a freer society. But if it's not checked, and if it's not assessed for what it's doing to people socially, then it gets out of hand very quickly. So if you take the environment as a metaphor or parallel to this, more and more businesses are becoming informed, and there's a real drive to inform them. Now, you've still got, people that take no notice, but there's a lot more that are doing it, and we've got to do the same in housing. And not having a capital gains tax when there was a fantastic opportunity. We had one of our finest prime ministers, Jacinda Ardern, who did so many good things, but she completely dropped the ball on the capital gains tax. It was just sort of tragic. She had the opportunity there. She had the tax working group recommend it. And she said she couldn't do it because Peter's part of the coalition partner, part of the coalition, refused to do it. So instead of saying, well, we'll go into the next election and push for it, and they won that next election, it's the current government, in fact, and they had a complete majority to do it, and she promised that she'd never do it while she was a Prime Minister. So it was a loss of opportunity. It was very uncharacteristic of her, because she did so many really fine things, but it was a missed opportunity. And had she done it, she would have only been doing what Australia does, what the UK does, what everybody, just about all like countries do. There's hardly any country that doesn't have a capital gains tax of some sort or other. So I don't think requires a lot to convince people, and sometimes, governments have just got to make decisions that are in the best interests of people. They can't be always pandering to a particular group that's already privileged. So we've done quite a lot of research on the differences between renting and home ownership. And we did a literature review of 125 international studies, and the benefits of home ownership completely outweigh what happens if you're renting. And this isn't just because richer people own their own houses, because a lot of richer people actually choose to rent. It's that they do a lot of these studies, they control for income differences, they control for socioeconomic differences and for educational differences, so that when they look at the effect, it's outside of those aspects. So the critical thing about home ownership is that you have a stake in the ground. You have a place that is your property, whether it's got a lawn or something around it, or whether it's part of an apartment or whatever. It's yours. And when you've got ownership, no one else can move you without a lot of difficulty. So you've got stability. You become a part of that community because you stay on for much longer periods of time. There's much greater mobility amongst people who are renting. They move much more often. So it builds stability in a community, but it also creates wealth, because what you pay in your mortgage or your shared equity or whatever it is that whatever way you're doing it is, you're getting a benefit for yourself. It's wealth. So, for example, when COVID came and people were in financial difficulties, people could take who'd borrowed, were in home ownership. They could pay interest only, or they could get a mortgage holiday, or they could negotiate things with the bank. Very few renters got any discounts at all. They had to keep paying throughout the whole thing. When you're in your own home, you have agency. You can add another, if it's a bungalow, you can add another room or whatever. If you have that capacity and you have an extra child or whatever, or you've got a grandparent coming to live with you, you can put up pictures. You've got agency, you've got control, you've got mana motuhaki, these things that are fundamental for people's sense of place. You can put up pictures, you can have pets, you can do what you like in your own place. You can't do that when you're renting. And especially in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we've got very, very, despite some of the recent reforms, we've still got incredibly liberal, by comparison with Europe, for example, laws. Well, recently there's been a proposal to change the tenancy legislation, which provided more stability, because if you couldn't remove a person unless there was good reason, and they were set reasons. And the National Party's come up and said, well, they want to remove the whole situation so that the landlord can just remove someone after 90 days. If they, and the argument they're using is that landlords would then take a punt on someone coming out of prison, say, or someone on a low income, or perhaps house someone from a gang or something. I mean, that's the argument that Chris Bishop has been using. I think it's completely spurious. I think it's really irresponsible. I mean, I think the National Party have put forward some quite good policies on housing. I'm not knocking all their housing policy, but on this one, I think it's irresponsible, and I told them so. I've told them directly. It's irresponsible because it's not protecting the rights of tenants. It's allowing great instability, and it's completely unrealistic to the unethical behaviour of landlords that goes on in this country. So there's a whole lot of landlords, and certainly not all landlords. There are very good landlords that look after people and care for them, care for their properties, and don't overcharge and whatever. But there is definitely quite a large group of investors who just use property managers. They don't even know what's going on often in their houses, and they're just interested in the bottom line return. And those people, if there's any difficulties, they just move people out. And we see family after family where this happens to, and the cost to children is terrible. And maybe that's something that would help if we could actually get some of these landlords to meet some of these families and to sort of broker relationships so they could know the impact this has. It's devastating. Yeah, well, some people argue that the cost of home ownership, given the sort of prices you have to pay in New Zealand at the moment, is just completely unrealistic. Well, many other like countries actually manage it. And we got ourselves into this situation, and we have to get ourselves out of it. I mean, we're morally bound to get ourselves out of it. And it all depends where you want to put your investment. So we've got to increase the supply of housing. That's very important. We've got to particularly increase the build of lower cost housing so it's more affordable. And we've got to invest in a whole range of home ownership products. And this can be done. You know, when we got into a crisis around COVID, we could pay for it. And we're still got one of the lowest indebted countries, even after COVID in the world. So what we need to do is to start working out a whole range of products, that home ownership products that can work for people. So rent to buy, where you, I mean, I think anyone in a state house should be able to buy it as long as that state house is replaced by another one. So the two work hand in hand together. So people have stability within where they're placed if they want to. And if they want to move, that's fine. Then the state house is there and they can buy somewhere else. But there needs to be products like shared equity products. So people might not be able to afford a whole mortgage, but they might be able to afford 50%. So, you know, the state, which can get really low interest, the lowest interest loans in the country, can help build those. And someone takes out a mortgage for 50%. The state owns the other 50. The state gets the capital gain as well, you know, if they sell it, as well as the family, and that gives them enough to deposit and get into the market and to be independent. I mean, it's not complicated things. There are models now that would show the state could actually do it quite profitably. It just needs the smarts. We need smart thinkers. We need economists and people who think people first and provide the economic solutions for people. And it is happening. And like in the churches, we're doing it. We've got, you know, I'm part of the Anglican Church, and throughout the country, we've got all sorts of projects going at the moment using church land and investing in it in ways that can help people that are, you know, that are on lower incomes. And the CHIPS organisations, this is why community housing providers need to be used much more often. So often Kāinga Ora chooses to do all this. You know, the minister's very strong on this is Megan Woods, is very strong on the state doing everything. Well, they should use community housing providers much more than they do. So we've got community housing providers that can put up developments of 300 at the moment. Well, if they should be given investments of 500, be able to put up 500 in the next development and 1,000 in the next one. In the UK, England alone, 10% of its entire housing stock is owned by housing associations, and they're doing shared equity schemes as well as rent, permanent rent arrangements, all sorts of really impressive social housing initiatives with much, much larger populations and much more extreme difficulties than we have. It's perfectly possible for us to do it. Well, shelter, a house, a home, is the most fundamental place. It's the place of intimacy. It's the place where we retire to. It's the place where we bring up our kids. It's the place of stability when we're not doing, where most of our leisure either occurs or emanates from. It's an essential part of our stability and protection. So it should be factored in first in any policy planning. And it is just so unintelligent that this is not happening and has not happened for so long. And it's because it's been commodified into dollars and cents rather than seen as important as food and clothing. These things are absolutely basic. So that needs to happen. The classic example is I've just finished a report for the Waitangi Tribunal on Māori home ownership from 1991 to 2021. And if you take during the 1990s when all these changes occurred, the government was beginning the first treaty settlements, very important in terms of developing the relationship and approaching colonisation. And in that 10 years of their government, the national government, they did 3 absolutely breakthrough treaty settlements. There was the fisheries, there was Ngāi Tahu, and there was Waikato Tainui. And they paid them 170 million each. It came to $510 million. Well, as I was doing this research, we started adding up what we thought the Māori mortgages alone were worth that the government sold off. And it's very hard to get it accurately, but it was, in our view, a conservative estimate was 800 million, a little over 800 million. 800 million is much more than 510 million. So on the one hand, the government was doing something that was historic and absolutely major, and you wouldn't want to knock it in any way. And it cost them 510 million. At the same time, like the right hand was doing that, the left hand was removing the essential stability in Māori households by over that same period, 18% of Māori homeowners, or the percentages, there was a reduction of 18% in home ownership over that same period. So in one place, they're building the relationships and consolidating, the foundations of a post-colonial society that addresses the relationships. On the other hand, they're taking away the security. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything that this was planned this way. It's like 2 parts of government doing the opposite thing, and it is just such bad policy making. So what you needed was those treaty settlements to develop and to build security, not to take it away from people's fundamental living places. And it's just tragic to see the way those 2 things happened at the same time.